apparent protesters now seem to be peacefully or voluntarily or somehow being led out of the Capitol right now. They seem to be heading toward. Well, maybe not.
So
is that the exit? If you look at the picture,
that camera, the shot that we have that you see right now is of them walking towards the House chamber. That's not the exit. That is
toward the House.
They're walking towards the House chamber right now, and that camera. So they're not going anywhere. They're going directly to where the debate is going in the House chamber.
Yeah, Casey Hunt, give us your sense of what we're seeing here and what's happening inside.
So, Lester, our NBC News producer, Haley Talbot, is actually inside the House chamber right now. She's serving as a producer for many of us because, of course, we have been taking these coronavirus precautions. She has been letting us know from inside the chamber what's going on. They have been yelling to members of the House to stay seated, warning them that they may need to get underneath their seats. They have been saying that people may need to relocate to the cloakroom. Now, the cloakrooms are rooms for individual. Each party has one. It's a private gathering place for members of Congress. They're both off the House floor. But as you were just talking about with Frank, you see those protesters packed in there. The cloakrooms are actually in between the House floor and where those protesters are. So the benefit perhaps of the cloakroom would be that it is a closed-off area. Remember, the House chamber is a big, wide open space. There are public galleries around the edges on the third floor of the Capitol. The chamber itself is on the second floor. That's the button that you push in the elevator if you want to go to the chamber is 2. Up on 3, there are these galleries that the public and the press typically can go and sit. You may see that during State of the Union speeches, for example, or something along those lines. There are also members apparently yelling. There's a lot of chaos, Haley reports, from the chamber on the House floor. And this, again, I think we need to just step back and take a second here, Lester, to underscore how rare, unusual, and troubling what is going on here is. This is not something that has happened very frequently. It's not unprecedented that there has been a breach of the House chamber, but it was many, many years ago. I'm going to have to go and do my research into, there was a shooting that occurred many years ago. Puerto Rican activists shot down at the floor. If you pull out the drawer in one of the desks that sits on the House floor, I've actually seen it. The bullet hole is still there from that incident. But of course, the idea then was that they learned a lot from that incident and that things like that were never supposed to happen again. So the rarity of someone actually getting into the House chamber and doing something like this really cannot be overstated. And again, these protesters right now, from what we can see on our cameras, are outside the House chamber, outside the doors. Now, the question is whether they'll get into those doors. And again, I'm looking at these texts from Haley Talbot, our producer, who is on the scene there and who is in the room watching all of this unfold. Lester.
All right, Casey, thank you. We're also getting a note here. Washington, D.C. Mayor Bowser has ordered a citywide curfew beginning at 6 p.m. today. We are seeing Ellison Barber. I don't know if you're with us. We are seeing what appears to be some sort of chemical agent or smoke. Yeah, Ellison, we're looking at a picture, I think, from the other side of where you are, the west side. But are you hearing anything that suggests tear gas is being used?
So we haven't in the last 10 minutes or so, but earlier we did hear at least 2 loud bangs that we believe were concussion grenades of some kind up near the steps. No tear gas on this side as far as we can tell, but you can see. I'll just let you, if we walk some this way to show you a little more of the crowd here and see if we can see anything. We haven't heard anything or seen anything over here that would indicate that tear gas is being used on this side of the Capitol, but we did hear a couple loud bangs earlier that we believe were some sort of concussion grenade or something similar up in this middle area near those doors up at the front, probably trying to move or get protesters to leave or move back, or some obviously they have not left their area. But on this side of the Capitol so far, Lester, we haven't seen anything so far that looks like any type of chemical agent or tear gas or anything of that nature.
Yeah, we were looking. It was the other side, and it was a waft of vapor or smoke. We'll try to. I don't want to say definitively. Obviously, that was tear gas, but we saw something in this image here a few moments ago. What appeared to be smoke wafting near the front of where that crowd is. We need to get to Pete Williams right now. Pete, you have some information about the whereabouts of the vice president right now.
Right. So I've talked to a member of the U.S. Senate who was on the Senate floor who told me a few moments ago that both the vice president and Charles Grassley, the president pro tem, were taken out of the Senate chamber to a secure location. The sergeant at arms took over the Senate chamber, told all the senators to stay away from the doors and that the doors had been locked. Just a few moments ago, however, this senator told me that they're now being moved out of the Senate chamber. The United States Senate is being evacuated. Members of the Senate are being led to a secure location. So they'll be taken probably out of the Capitol building by, I would assume, underground tunnels. I can tell you, having worked up there as a Capitol Hill aide on both the House and Senate sides, that there's tunnels all over the place that lead to all the various office buildings on the Hill. So it's possible to evacuate the Senate without taking them outside, and that's what's being done now. So this protest is now evacuated the United States Senate.
All right, Pete Williams, thanks very much. And again, much of this crowd fired up by the president himself a bit earlier as he spoke to that rally outside the White House. The president is now tweeting, not about specifically what you're seeing. He's tweeting about Vice President Pence, who announced today that he would follow the Constitution, the law, and not do anything that would attempt to try and overturn the results of the election, something that is beyond his power. The president tweeting, Mike Pence didn't have the courage to do what should have been done to protect our country and our Constitution, giving states a chance to certify a correct set of facts, not the fraudulent or inaccurate ones which they were asked to previously certify. USA demands the truth. So the president holding fast to the fantasy that the vote was an illegitimate one, and this coming as these pictures no doubt being seen in the White House and around the world of our Capitol under siege. The crowd does not appear to be violent, although there have been some individual reports, but they have certainly not only breached the outer perimeter, but some the inside. That's where Frank Thorpe continues to, he's one of our producers on lockdown right now. Frank, what more can you add about those folks who we saw inside the Capitol?
So we've still been locked down in our gallery, in our office here in the Capitol. So I haven't actually seen any protesters because we're not even allowed to leave our space. But I can tell you that there's a lot of members of the press here and staff who are concerned and worried about even how to get out of the Capitol if they wanted to. They're trying to get out. They're trying to leave. And there's really not even a way to do that because Capitol Police has told us to stay out of the hallway, stay away from the windows, and avoid the protesters at all costs. There's still aides who are saying that they're on lockdown here in the Capitol, and we understand that there still also might be senators on the floor, but there's also, discussions here and talks of trying to get gas masks distributed to those who are here in the Capitol in case that there's tear gas that's deployed within the Capitol. So, I mean, to be honest, we're trying to find out where those are. Right now, it's a question of how long this is going to last. We have gotten close to no guidance from Capitol Police other than just to stay where we are. But as I said, I mean, the Senate and the House still remains in recess, and I think both aides are texting us. And lawmakers are trying to figure out what's going on. This is still a very tense situation in the Capitol.
It's a 6 p.m. curfew.
All right, Frank Thorpe, continue to stay safe as the Capitol is on lockdown, an image that will certainly make a lot of people shudder, this scene right now of protesters who have laid siege to the U.S. Capitol, disrupting the process of the formal vote count of the electoral votes. As Pete Williams explained earlier, one of the, if not the oldest acts of our government, one of the oldest rituals of our government, but suspended right now as lawmakers have been locked down or in some cases ushered away from the Capitol as this situation is dealt with. I understand we got another tweet from the president. Unfortunately, I don't have it in front of me. Bear with me 1 second to see if I can pull it up. Oh, here it is on the screen. President Trump moments ago tweeting, "Please support our Capitol Police and law enforcement. They are truly on the sides of our country. Stay peaceful." Interesting wording, support our Capitol Police. But that's the first acknowledgement of some of what we're seeing right now at the Capitol. Just to bring you back up to date, if you're coming into all this late, today, as dictated by the Constitution, a joint session of Congress to essentially go through the formal ritual of counting the electoral votes, brought out in a fine mahogany case, a process that normally takes a half hour every 4 years, but one that we knew was going to take longer this year. Many Republicans announcing they would stand up and object to the results in what amounted to the battleground states in the election, the states that Joe Biden won. This on the same day the president was promoting the idea of this rally of his supporters, which took place outside the White House. The president speaking. And as we expected within that joint session, Republicans did in fact begin to object. First state in line, Arizona, which Joe Biden won narrowly, leading to up to 2 hours of debate and then 2 hours for each subsequent state. So a process we knew would go late into the night, perhaps the wee hours of the morning, but all that now on hold as we have watched this situation develop outside the Capitol. This is the view from the east front. We've seen other pictures from the other side of similar crowds. Some managed to get inside the Capitol as police began to retreat. The doors were still open. A number of people made their way in and have apparently reached as far into a cloakroom outside the House chambers. And they continue to chant right now. So that's where we're at. I'll check in one more time with Ellison Barber, who's keeping an eye on this crowd. Do things appear to be in hand, or police taking any control there?
Hey, Lester, yeah, it seems like some of the people that were on the steps have started to disperse. We had people coming by telling other people that on the other side of the Capitol, that's where people are now going, trying to climb over, possibly some sort of scaffolding. So it seems like some people are now moving around to try and see kind of the other areas where activity protesters are. This area, though, for the last 10, 12 minutes or so since we last talked, it's kind of stayed the same. People here not giving up much ground on those steps in front of us, but some people now who aren't on the steps, they are moving about and moving to the other side of the Capitol as well. We haven't seen any sort of violent clashes on this side of the Capitol, and we haven't seen police deploy anything like tear gas or any sort of chemical agent. The Capitol Police on the steps on the Senate side of the House, they have been able to keep protesters from going further up those stairs, but on the other steps, the steps in the middle, you can smell something now. Do you smell? I'm not entirely sure what that is, if that's smoke or something. There's something that we're starting to smell out here. It smells like something might be burning, but I'm not entirely sure what that is or where it is coming from. But yeah, this group right here, they're staying put, holding the areas that they have gained, if you will. And they're chanting now. I'm trying to listen to hear exactly what they're saying. It starts kind of up at the top and then makes its way down here. But there is something smells like it's burning. From where, I'm not entirely sure, but you can smell smoke now, and it's unclear where that is coming from. But yeah, Lester, this group's still here. People have started to move to the other side of the Capitol, though, who are on this side, as some people came through and told us that where it's happening, people are on the other side of the Capitol, so they were moving sort of to, I guess, meet up with and possibly help that group with whatever was going on that side. This group staying put, and now it smells like we have something burning in the area near here. Lester?
All right, we'll let you narrow that down and where that may be occurring. Ellison Barber, thanks very much. Again, we saw pictures of people from inside the Capitol, protesters who made their way in as police began their retreat. And as was pointed out by our Frank Thorpe, these are individuals who have gone in unscreened, something that obviously doesn't happen in government buildings, certainly not the Capitol of the United States. This is moments ago. You can see some of the protesters. And now, to my understanding, as they walk in that area, that's the direction of the House chambers themselves. Casey Hunt has a little more color as to what's happening there. Casey?
That's right, Lester. A very tense scene right now inside the House chamber, which, as you point out, is just at the end of that hallway where you're seeing these people walk. Our producer in the chamber now locked down as one of the main sets of doors has been barricaded. Most of the members were evacuated from the floor after being handed gas masks, basically. That, of course, in the event that police were to deploy tear gas or something like that, they would need gas masks to protect themselves. They were not handed these masks because we have seen any evidence of anything like that already happening, but rather as a precaution. But it's been a very chaotic scene on the House floor. Members very concerned, one praying over others. There are a number of members of the House who are still in the chamber with some of the reporters that are there. Again, we talked earlier about those galleries that are up on the third floor. The House floor itself is on the second floor. There's not usually members in those galleries, but they were there because of the coronavirus precautions. It was a way to spread people out, to follow social distancing guidelines and restrictions. So some of those members still in the chamber. But again, Lester, underscoring here that now we have both, as Pete Williams reported, the Senate, floor of the Senate has been evacuated. The House, the floor of the House has been evacuated. If you can hear something going on behind me, it's the emergency alert that Muriel Bowser has issued for the curfew here. It's now setting off all of our phones, and you can hear audible alarms here, but it's related to that. It's not something separate that's going on here at the Capitol, although it does sound like we may be about to get an overhead announcement here. So we're going to keep an ear on that, and we'll let you know if we have any further updates from here, Lester.
Yeah, please feel free to flag me if you've got something there. Casey, thanks very much. We were looking for a moment ago the other side of the Capitol. Actually, are you hearing that announcement with Casey? No, can't hear it. There was some kind of announcement in the Capitol.
Right now we've just got a siren, but I will make sure that we are recording here, and we'll let you know if they say anything audible that we're able to hear about what we should do here. Again, Lester, we are in the Russell Senate office building, which is across the street from the Capitol building where most of this drama is playing out. And we are locked down here. There are tunnels underground, as Pete referenced. Yes, Lester.
All right, Casey, thank you. I want to bring in NBC News national security analyst Frank Figliuzzi. Frank, I've got a lot of questions, but I just want to know your thoughts as all this unfolds and what we are witnessing right now.
Lester, so as a security professional, I know there'll be time after this incident is cleared and resolved to go through and understand where failures and compromises occurred and where planning may have been inadequate. But right now, just a couple of thoughts as it's still playing out. First, if you're part of this group or you think you want to join the group that is breaching security, I want you to know something. I want you to know that you are committing a federal violation. You are going to become a federal criminal. Your acts are going to be investigated by the FBI and the U.S. Capitol Police. This is serious business. Threats and assaults on members of the Senate and House, even greater in terms of federal consequences. So you need to think through your actions if you're headed into the district or you're part of this group that's doing this. Secondly, we're watching the tension play out between a democratic republic that allows and wants its people to have access to its legislative body, and the need for incredible security during one of the most volatile periods in recent history. And today we saw that tension bleed into each other. The need to have the public access and watch its government while, and exercise civil liberties and protest rights, while others are instigating a breach of compromise that actually undermines the very democracy that allows you to do the protest in the first place. Lastly, Lester, we have a president for the past 4 years who's claimed to be the law and order president, but let's be clear here. He has made the job of law enforcement today and in the past all the more harder. They are facing an incredible challenge right now, and he's just tweeted that we need to understand that law enforcement is on the right side. I don't know what that means, but I know this. It's not helpful to law enforcement when you're threatening them, when you're breaching security of our nation's capital, and when you're preventing democracy from actually happening.
As you said, there will be time for after-action reviews, but watching this play out on live television, there seemed to be a rather small number of police officers outside that east front, and that there was some signal to retreat, and that's when folks were able to breach inside. I know we don't know a lot about. Are you surprised there wasn't a more robust security force visible at the outset of this, knowing the passions that all this has brought?
Yeah, Lester, those who monitor the sites of the extreme and even violent militia groups and groups like Proud Boys and QAnon, we've seen this playing out in the past couple of weeks. We've seen the chatter. We've seen the talk of how to overwhelm the Capitol Police, how to breach the Capitol. And I know that certainly the federal agencies monitor many of those same chat sites and extremist groups. So this is not a surprise. I don't quite understand how we got to this point today, and we're going to need some answers about Capitol Police deployment of National Guard and why it appears that insufficient resources were available.
All right, Frank, as you said, there'll be lots of questions, lots of answers later, but right now, the here and now is you've got people who have gathered on both sides of the Capitol. They have essentially stormed the steps there. Some have made their way inside. Police have now set up, at least at some parts of the Capitol, you don't see it in this picture certainly, but they have set up kind of human chains there in front. Here you've got, they've essentially created a buffer zone in the west front. By the way, this is the area where Joe Biden will take the oath of office in just a few weeks on that west front. That's typically where the seating is for the inauguration, the swearing of a new president. So the crowd there has been, it's a little bit of a higher climb to enter from that side. And thus you see most of the crowd here on the east side now, the east front, as it's known, of the Capitol. We've been talking off and on with Frank Thorpe. He's an NBC News producer who, like everyone in the Capitol right now, is in lockdown. Frank, it has to be an eerie feeling. You're watching these pictures and you're inside the building, but you really can't see what's happening. What are you hearing?
Yeah, it's a confusing situation, Lester, because to be honest, a lot of the members of the who just don't feel comfortable, who want to get out of the Capitol, have no idea if they can leave, and we have no idea where the protesters are inside the building. I can tell you, going back to the video that we saw earlier of the protesters walking towards the House chamber, it's just I can't stress to you how just unprecedented this situation is in terms of having this many people inside the Capitol that have not been screened. I mean, as you noted, a lot of these protesters are peaceful, but just having people within the Capitol who haven't gone through the screening process to get into this building is that's concerning to not only the lawmakers, but the aides that are here that are locked down in their offices, the press that are locked down in their offices as well. We have another producer, Haley Talbot, who is currently in the process of trying to get out of the House chamber. She was there to cover the House proceedings during the debate, and she's been taken out of the House chamber, but she's trying to figure out how they can actually get out of the building. She's just with members of Congress who say that they're calling their families to say that they're okay. I mean, I can tell you that most of the members of the press here are doing the same, just to give them an update. But it's a tense feeling.
Yeah, Frank Thorpe, thank you for that update. Finishing the thought, a tense situation to be sure. As we, at least in this video, we see folks walking back and forth in plain view of police officers. We don't know what their orders are or what the plan is, but no one in this crowd seems to be aggressive, but simply walking, exercising free reign of the Capitol, an area that, as Frank had pointed out, has been closed off to the general public for months and months because of COVID protocols and restrictions. But now inside and very close to that House chamber, where a number of people remain right now, very concerned about what is going to happen here, how they plan to clear the Capitol. Will it involve any chemical agents? Are there enough gas masks? So these are questions I don't think any of us woke up thinking we'd be asking as this process began, this joint session of Congress to entertain the objections, kind of the last gasp of Republicans trying to throw a monkey wrench into the results of the election. The conclusion, a foregone one, but nonetheless a demonstration by some members of both the Senate and House and a determination to challenge some of the battleground state victories for Joe Biden. But here is where we are at right now. A scene, as I noted, not unlike ones we've seen over the years over disputed elections in faraway places in the globe. But this is America. This is the U.S. Capitol right now. There is the American flag, and beneath it, these crowds of people now who have stormed, trying to make their wishes known. This is a day in which the president spoke, even as his own vice president announced that he could essentially no longer support this idea of trying to turn the election upside down. The Senate Majority Leader, Mitch McConnell, in very impassioned remarks at the beginning of debate, saying that those who support these objections are an embarrassment to themselves and the embarrassment to their country. So he also breaking ranks with the president, but Donald Trump continuing to press forward his claim that he's due a second term. And you can see police have, this is again the west, we just switched, but that other shot you were looking at was the west front, where police have been able to establish some kind of a barrier and stopping the crowds. They appear to have detained someone there. But by and large, they have held their ground there, and you can see they put up a pretty serious line of blue on those. I believe those are the bleachers that have been put in place for the inauguration on the west side, where that is typically held. Let me bring in Casey. I'm sorry. Let me bring in Hallie Jackson. To get some more perspective. So the president is acknowledging what is happening here, but doesn't seem to be taking great steps to tell people to go home.
He's done a tweet. I mean, he's done a single tweet here, Lester, and even for some people who used to work for him, you are seeing a groundswell of some, at least, saying, you need to do more, Mr. President, basically. He is probably the only person, and it's even arguable at that, who could potentially get that message through to the people who are now, as you put it succinctly, Lester, earlier in the show, putting the United States Capitol under siege. That is what we are seeing at this moment. You have to remember, Lester, this is a building, and I'm looking at this. I've done countless, live shows from the building in and out. It just doesn't look like this, right? There's security around the building, but more importantly, Lester, or equally importantly, there's also private homes. There's daycares. There are other, facilities unconnected to the functioning of government, right, that are in the vicinity of the Hill where we're talking about here. And this is affecting many more people than just the people you're seeing on the screens, than just the duly elected officials of this country. Key, first and foremost, first priority, safety. There's also a question secondarily, as you are looking at that shot, it appeared somebody being pulled out on a stretcher. Secondarily is what happens now. We understand, as we've been reporting here, this lockdown is happening at the Capitol. What does this mean for the process that, 2 hours ago, Lester, we started talking about the Electoral College vote count? I can tell you that I've been texting with sources and one Republican official suggesting that perhaps this will, maybe they hope, give some senators pause in continuing the objections in the vote count. We don't know that that's actually going to be the case. We don't know how this is going to impact the actual procedures. I think the biggest priority for folks right now is making sure that the people inside the building are safe. You have to wonder, Lester, I ask this question, where is the president? We know physically where President Trump is. We understand, based on the reporting from people in the pool at the White House, he was in the Oval Office at least for a portion of the afternoon here as these protests, now a frankly mob, stormed the steps of the Capitol. Is he going to speak on television? Is he going to give an address and give remarks? We don't have any guidance on that. We have no reason to suspect he might, other than that is perhaps the expectation of the country's leader at a moment like this just surreal and extraordinary moment, and one that's going to go down in American history, Lester. So again, first priority, safety. Secondarily, how do you get past this moment? I know that you got to imagine these officers, and we're seeing it coming in from all parts. This is what I'm talking about, Lester. You're looking at the Capitol complex. And then that's Constitution, right? So that is on the House side. The House office buildings are in that. I think this is our chopper shot from our local affiliate, if I am guessing correctly. You can see those House office buildings on the other side of the street. The underground passages that you're talking about connect those different facilities. The street obviously is shut down, police in place. The other piece of this is the law enforcement presence. This rally had been what was originally a rally, which has turned into something very different, had been planned. It was a known event. It was known that people who were supporting President Trump were traveling in from all over the country to be on the National Mall at the Ellipse, where the president, by the way, spoke, right? Didn't just watch. He actually actively went and spoke and engaged with those protesters. And now hear what we're seeing at the Capitol, Lester.
All right, Hallie, thank you. On the phone with us right now is Republican Representative Adam Kinzinger from Illinois. Congressman, thank you for joining us. First of all, are you and your colleagues safe right now?
Yeah, everybody's safe. I don't want to give my location, but I'll tell you this is madness, and anybody that calls themselves a Republican like myself should be very ashamed right now. And I don't know if this has ever happened in history. It's disgusting, and this is not how democracies and how politics works.
I don't think a lot of folks would disagree with you on that. Can you tell us, you were in the middle of debate, was there simply an adjournment and you were taken to a special place? I mean, how did it all play out from your point of view?
Yeah, in my case, I kind of started seeing things unfurl, so I came back to a different location, and but I have been talking to people that are on the floor, and obviously when the Capitol was breached, they did security protocol, which they're good at, but significantly outnumbered. Throwing on escape hoods. I mean, we have these emergency escape hoods that we think it's one of those doomsday scenarios that we'll never use. We're using those. And right now, I think it's a matter of hoping that cooler heads prevail, hoping that the president actually quits being a coward and calls in the D.C. Guard and actually takes some leadership for a moment. But until then, we're going to continue to do what we need to do to be safe.
Are you, what we're watching right now, do you lay that at the president's feet?
Do I think, wait, say that again, I couldn't understand that.
Yeah, what we're watching right now with the siege of the Capitol, do you lay this at the president's feet? Is he responsible?
Yeah. I mean, look, absolutely. Not just in his speech today where he basically implied this was going to happen. We've seen this all over Twitter. I don't look at Parler, but I hear it's been all over Parler. This is not a surprise to anybody and shouldn't be. And I've said for weeks that I fear violence on January 6th. And for the president to go out today when everybody's in a heightened emotional state after being falsely promised that somehow Congress can magically pick the next president, he completely shirked his responsibility as president to keep the American people safe.
A number of your colleagues in the House and certainly a number from the Senate have announced, and they've already demonstrated that they are going to try to reject some of these electoral votes. Do you think that this will stop the process, or do you think that they will want to carry on once order is restored there?
Well, because the Constitution, is enduring, the process will go forward. If any of my friends or colleagues continue with the objection, I think that is a disgrace. I think the reality is, first off, it was a fool's errand anyway. It was a grift, an attempt to raise money. And now, after this, if we, assuage these actions, we can only expect more in the future.
What was it like? I don't know if you actually heard Senate Majority Leader Mitch McConnell's remarks today, but he essentially broke ranks with the president and said it's over, it's done in so many words. What was it like to hear that?
Well, it was good. I wish he'd have said it a while ago, but. The bottom line is we have too many people out here that want to avoid temporary pain by telling people what they don't want to hear. So they go along with this magical idea that Congress gets to pick the president. Congress doesn't. And what we're seeing now is, the result of false hope given to people. And so it was great to see the majority leader say that. I hope all the leadership in the House and Senate say the exact same thing. And I hope when we reconvene finally that we move forward and just accept the results as the American people voted for, whether we like those results or not.
I think it's fair to say that much of your party will bear some of the stain of this day. going forward. There is also the vote in Georgia that we're watching very closely, that when all is said and done, we could be looking at a Democratic-held Senate. How serious is the damage to the Republican Party going forward?
I think it's serious. I think, did we make gains within minority communities? Sure, but we're losing in one very terminal demographic, and that is young people. As young people grow older, they're rejecting Republican politics. We've gotten away from the Reagan-esque idea of explaining the compassion of conservatism, and we've relegated to a culture war. That's not the Republican Party that me at 42 years old was in love with. I love the idea of a strong American leadership and leadership around the globe. We have to get back to that, but we're going to bear the consequences of this for a little bit.
Before I let you go, have you or any of your colleagues, is there any effort right now to try and get in touch with the White House and say, please make this stop?
I don't know. I think right now it's kind of the, Maslow's hierarchy of needs. We're at the bottom of that and just getting through this moment. But I certainly hope people with rank in the House are doing that and in the Senate. And we go beyond some, tweet saying thank you to the Capitol Police. And we actually start calling for real action to restore order to the people's house. Otherwise, we're no different than any of, these failed democracies around the world.
All right. Well, Congressman Adam Kinzinger, Republican from Illinois, we thank you for being with us, and we're grateful that you and your colleagues are okay right now. Please stay safe, sir.
Thanks, sir.
All right, we continue to watch this crowd outside the Capitol. It began as a day of peaceful protest, and largely what we've seen, at least in the view of the camera, has been peaceful. Nonetheless, this crowd has breached beyond where they were supposed to be. Many have breached actually inside the Capitol itself. So this is an ongoing situation. We don't know what's happening on the law enforcement level inside to contain those who went in unscreened, and based on the pictures we've seen, have had largely free reign of very critical parts of the Capitol. But that is how it is playing out right now. Ellison Barber is on the east front of the Capitol, on the edge of this crowd, watching it all play out. How would you characterize things right now, Ellison?
Hey, Lester, we're starting to see people come down from the steps who are claiming at least to have been inside. Two people came by and walked by us, and they said, we made it inside. I asked them if they wanted to talk, and they said I probably shouldn't, and kept going. There was another guy in militia-like tan garb who walked by us, and I think he didn't see my microphone initially, and he said, we made it to Nancy's office. When I asked him to stop and talk to us, he also declined on that. But there's kind of been, if those people were in fact inside, a celebratory mood here for them as they make their way out. You can see up on the steps here where people are still gathered. Off to the left side of the steps, Capitol Police have kind of congregated in a group there, and they've been there for the last little bit, kind of just standing by to the side of these protesters. We have seen a couple snipers, or what appear to be snipers, on the roof of the U.S. Capitol. Other than that, though, the situation on this side has remained somewhat calm. It's not really the right word for this, but as you said, we have not seen any acts of violence per se right in front of us, but we have seen a forceful crowd as they made their way up to the front and initially passed through those bicycle barricades. They are still here, and as some people come out and claim to have been inside the U.S. Capitol, those people are then being greeted amongst this crowd as heroes of sorts, being cheered for going inside. One person who had come out, they had some sort of liquid water type thing on them. They said that they had been sprayed. But again, none of those people were willing to speak with us on camera. You can hear the crowd right now cheering some as they have flags, many of them Trump flags. A Don't Tread on Me flag held on both sides now have been hoisted up kind of on the sides there. So this crowd has stayed here where they are. Capitol Police on the side, not seeming to necessarily engage with the crowd here, but as I said, we haven't seen any sort of violent acts from the crowd here, but people who are claiming to have been inside are being celebrated as they make their way out. Lester?
Yeah, Ellison, stand by a second. I just want to share from our investigative producer, Tom Winter, a spokesperson for the Washington, D.C. Fire and EMS, says they have several people have been treated for injuries, and there's an unconfirmed report. We'll wait to confirm it of a more even more serious nature that we'll try to firm up. But Ellison, as we watch this crowd, many of these people had gone to a protest, an organized, permitted protest today, and have followed the crowd here. Have you seen any children in the crowd?
Yeah, quite a few, actually. I don't know if we can walk a little and show you some of the people who are here. At various points throughout the day, we have seen families. We have seen people here with their dogs, with their pets. We were here all morning. We've been here since about 8 a.m. There's a dog right over there. There you have it. This was a peaceful protest. People were here. They were vocal. They wanted their voices heard, but things were relatively calm. And in a split second, you saw the crowd rush the front towards the barricades and make their way up here. And it felt like the entire mood, the whole day, it changed. We have not seen any overt acts of violence, but as soon as, this is where the initial breach was, right over here, as soon as that initial breach happened, we did see, once we made our way up to the front, and we saw somebody being put on a stretcher and taken out of here. I'm not sure if she fell, she was pushed over, or what, but there was a lot of blood left on the ground where someone had clearly been hurt in the process, maybe inadvertently, but in the process of these barricades being breached and making their way up here. But not as many children here right now, and some people, I think, have stayed a little bit further back. But yeah, I mean, this was a largely peaceful protest. A lot of people had come throughout the day. At one point, a group of people dressed in militia-like garb, who I believe were Proud Boys. They're not wearing their normal attire that they wear, but they were saying a term that Proud Boy tends to say and chant as they walk around. They had been kind of walking around the perimeter at one point of the U.S. Capitol and chanting. But other than that, things were calm. And then in that split second, you saw the crowd rush. You saw people break through these bicycle barricades and make their way up to the Capitol, and everything changed. But yeah, a lot of families have been here throughout the day, though some seem to have dispersed and left at this point. Lester?
All right, Ellison, thank you very much. As we watch this extraordinary situation play out, it's hard not to look at this and not feel that there are at least, and not to be hyperbolic, but to feel that there's some elements of a coup attempt in what we're watching right now. I want to go to Frank Thorpe. We've been hearing from him by telephone. He's in his office there, our NBC producer office there in the Capitol under lockdown. I understand you have some video, Frank.
Yeah, so, Lester, this is some stunning video, I have to say. I don't think I've ever expected to see anything like this in my entire career covering Congress. The idea of people who have broken into the Capitol and taken over the Senate floor. This is about a dozen folks who came from outside, and they're just mulling around looking through desks. There's a guy sitting there in the gallery above. He asked, "Who are you with? Who are you with?" And that was about time for me to go. Walking through the hallways, I have to say, it's a weird scene in that there was, some protesters that were walking through the hallways, and Capitol Police were kind of following them, but they weren't necessarily arresting them. It's really unclear as to how they're really dealing with the protesters. I haven't seen any arrests, but I've also been locked in up in our offices. So we're just sheltered in place at the moment right now, but I have to say that this scene that you're seeing right now on television is absolutely stunning. The idea that these people have come from outside and broken into the Capitol and decided to take the Senate floor like this, where just about an hour and a half or 2 hours ago, they were debating an objection to the Electoral College. It's just a stunning scene.
Who you with?
Stunning doesn't even begin to describe it, Frank. If this picture makes you sick, I think you're probably not alone. This is inside the chambers of the American Congress, people freely walking among the tables and the desks. It's just beyond unbelievable.
I mean, Lester,
I want to go to yeah.
Just to kind of nail down on this point, though. I mean, they still need to finish this count. They still need to be able to return here and do their work. And there's no way that this will require sweeps. I mean, once they actually clear the building, they'll have to sweep the chamber. I mean, the two chambers of the House and the Senate are basically known within the Capitol as two of the safest places in the entire Capitol Hill complex. I mean, and they're protected by Capitol Police. There are details for leadership members. I mean, this is just a completely outside of the realm of possibility situation in which that, it's going to take an enormous amount of time just to clear out and to do a security sweep of the desks, of the hallways, of the rooms before they would be able to even start to count again.
All right, Frank, continue to stay safe inside there. On the phone with us is Democratic Congressman Brendan Boyle from Pennsylvania. Congressman, first of all, are you in a safe location and okay with your colleagues? Congressman Boyle, do you hear me okay? Okay, we've lost him. We'll try to get him back and get a perspective of what's happening inside with members of Congress. I want to go to Kelly O'Donnell. Kelly was at that rally that where this is an offshoot of that rally. You heard the president speak today. Give us a sense of the tone and things we heard that might have suggested it would end up what we're looking at.
Well, spending hours today with some of the Trump supporters who are now protesters, the president repeatedly urged them to fight. And he meant that metaphorically, but he also may have meant that in this kind of show and demonstration. He repeatedly said, we will walk down Pennsylvania Avenue to the U.S. Capitol. And I began that march walking along with a number of those in attendance. And I could hear people around me, Lester, saying, the president said he's walking with us. I knew that the president had returned to the White House, but his supporters believed he was walking with them. One man who was just next to me said, but he said he's walking, so I'm sure he's walking. It's just an anecdote that gives you an idea of how the president has this kind of powerful connection with his supporters. He has just tweeted again in the last few minutes, and he says, I am asking everyone at the U.S. Capitol to remain peaceful. No violence. Remember, we in uppercase are the party of law and order. Respect the law and order of our great men and women in blue. Thank you. But this is the same president who repeatedly told them to fight, repeatedly told his supporters that he was robbed of this election, and they were too, that their votes were discounted, manipulated, thrown out by various states, things that have not been supported by the facts, and in many ways incited this kind of fervor. The president always measures how he is being perceived by his crowd size, and there was an enormous crowd today. And as you could see this play out, as Ellison pointed out, certainly there were families there. There were several people with dogs. I'm one of those dog people who always talks to the people who are walking their dogs with these kinds of events. And there were the flags, and there were all of the things that in a typical Trump rally environment before the election were much more upbeat. These folks were determined to walk to the Capitol and to make their message known. Many of them probably did not know it was going to turn into this, but clearly some people planned this kind of breach of the Capitol, and in many ways the kind of images that Frank, our colleague, was just showing us, a disrespect of these institutions that they are angry about. There was so much talk today among Trump supporters and those speaking at the rally prior to the president about anger toward even Republicans, believing that there were Republicans who were not standing up for President Trump. And of course, we heard the president repeatedly urge Mike Pence, his vice president, who has been unfailingly loyal for 4 years, to do what the president wanted today. Mike Pence did not do that in a lengthy statement where he explained what he believes to be the limits constitutionally of his role. And now we have this, with an uncertain way of how this gets resolved. Today is the day the counts are supposed to be completed. That has been disrupted. As Frank and other colleagues have described, the scene at the Capitol remains tense, volatile, and unknown. I've been in touch with various elected officials that I know from my time covering the Capitol. All have said they are safe, but in a new world that few could have imagined. It was predicted, and yet still so hard to imagine as we watch this unfold. Lester?
All right, Kelly, thanks very much for that. As we watch these live pictures, this is the east front of the Capitol, and that crowd continuing to occupy the steps and surrounding the entrance there. On the phone with us, we're going to try again Democratic Congresswoman from Virginia, Abigail Spanberger. Congresswoman, can you tell us, are you safe and in an okay place right now?
Yes, thank you so much, Lester. I am. I'm in a holding room with a lot of other members of Congress after we were evacuated out of the floor in the gallery area.
Can you tell us how things played out when you became aware of that the Capitol had been breached and how you were let out?
So we initially got alerts on our phone. The Capitol Police were just extraordinary in keeping us updated. We all got out our gas masks, which are under the seats on the floor and in the gallery, because we know that there was some chemical irritants that were deployed in various parts of the Capitol. And so we made a couple efforts at trying to evacuate, but at one point that became difficult because there were people banging on the doors of the floor of the House of Representatives, and so at that point in time, there was an effort to, of course, lock all the doors and barricade the doors, and it took multiple efforts for us to be able to make our way safely, and then depart the Capitol and gallery areas where we were gathered to participate in what is our constitutional duty of counting electors. It's a straightforward process that is supposed to be procedural, but one that we were intending to carry out today until it was interrupted.
Did you come face to face with any of the protesters?
I did not. Where we were on our way out, there were protesters who were laid out in the prone position. Capitol Police had clearly taken control of the situation, and as they were leading us and members of the press out, that was at that point as close as we got, kind of person to person.
Were you and your colleagues wearing gas masks as you were leaving?
Some people were, so we all had them. We had them opened. We had them deployed. There was some people were saying that we needed to put them on. Some didn't have them on, but everybody was ready because, again, in the end, the way we actually evacuated out of the gallery, we did not go in the direction where there was the chemical irritant. And so I had mine on for a bit, but mostly had it off and didn't come in contact with any of the irritant.
All right, well, we're glad you're okay. So let's talk now about what we are seeing, what is happening outside the Capitol. Give me your thoughts, how we got here, and where do we go forward?
I'm a former intelligence officer, and my whole background is understanding the challenges that foreign governments are facing. The scene that we saw on Capitol Hill, the banging, the yelling, the screaming, the demands to enter the chamber, the United States Congress, those are the sorts of things that happen in third world nations, the sorts of places where our diplomats and intelligence officers write home to the United States and say, this is a dangerous scenario, this is an endangered democracy. It's deeply, deeply disturbing what we saw at the U.S. Capitol today. But my appreciation to the Capitol Police for doing everything they possibly could to keep us, our staff, our teams, the cafeteria workers, sanitation workers, and employees of the Capitol and members of the press safe as they worked to systematically ensure that active threats were subdued and that we could get to a safe place.
All right, Representative Abigail Spanberger from Virginia, thank you for taking some time to speak with us. We're glad you and your colleagues are okay.
Thank you so much. And again, thanks to the Capitol Police and Metro Police who's been responding to help as well. Thank you so much, Lester.
Yep. All right. Yes, and we see the Capitol Police there have taken up a position on the west side of the Capitol there in the yellow jackets up there, the high visibility yellow, keeping the line of protesters from entering at least that side. But clearly a situation that is beyond anything most people could imagine taking place right now. I do want to go to Pete Williams, if Pete is standing by, because it was brought up a moment ago. What we saw today, the beginning of this joint session of Congress, whether there's objections or not, Pete, there's something magic to this date. It has to happen today, correct?
It has to start today. That's certainly right. That's set by statute. That's the Electoral Count Act. That's this law that was passed 133 years ago that guides the process. Now, it doesn't say it has to end today, but it has to start today. So it's met that constitutional requirement. And of course, at some point when this is all resolved, it's going to resume. And it doesn't really matter how long it takes. I mean, they've got until the 20th, obviously, which is Inauguration Day. A couple of thoughts, Lester. Number one, This scene is obviously going to cause some serious rethinking about how the inauguration itself will be planned. Now, we knew it was already scaled back because of the pandemic, no parade, for example, but you just know, and I just got off the phone with one law enforcement person, they're looking at these scenes and thinking, well, what changes do they need to make in the plan for the inaugural? Now, I will say that an inauguration is a much bigger event that involves many more law enforcement organizations. There's much tighter security, but still, there's got to be some rethinking. One other thing, Lester, we've been told now by two separate law enforcement organizations. You saw a picture earlier of a person being wheeled out of the Capitol, or at least being wheeled outside the Capitol on a gurney with apparent injuries. And we're told now by two separate law enforcement agencies that one person was shot inside the U.S. Capitol a short time ago by a member of law enforcement. Now, we don't know what law enforcement person this was, or whether it was someone from the Capitol Police, from Metro Police. I mean, there are a number of different police agencies that are responsible for security in that area, and when there is something like this, there's an all-hands-on-deck kind of response from a number of different police agencies that can respond to help, police and federal agencies. So we don't know which organization was involved, but and we don't know what the condition of the person who was shot. And we don't know the circumstances of it. All I can report is that law enforcement officials tell us that one person was shot inside the U.S. Capitol by a member of law enforcement.
All right, Pete Williams, thank you for adding that. It's extraordinary that we have not, right now, it seems to be no effort, at least from the outside, to remove anyone. But at the same time, no one here is advancing. The picture has remained rather constant here on both sides of the Capitol. People crowded in, waving flags, essentially moving their rally to the doorsteps of the Capitol as members of Congress have been ushered to safe places. We heard a description a moment ago of reaching for gas masks that had positioned at their desks, and some of them actually donning them as they made their way to safer areas, still hearing the beating of people trying to get in the door. So an extraordinary scene continuing to unfold there. Let me bring in, if I can right now, Hallie Jackson again. Hallie, you've been watching all this play out. Is this a fear that you had heard expressed, from those associated with the White House, that something like this could happen?
Here's the thing, Lester, for people who have tracked movements in many ways among people, sort of the fringe elements of what you could call the president's base, there had been discussion of this day specifically for a while now, right? Which is raising the question, as Pete's talked about, and as others, of the law enforcement presence. That is obviously something that, as you showed on that shot, you could see some of the presence here at the Capitol, but this just incredibly upsetting, I think it's fair to say, scene at the Capitol. I will say that you are now seeing more and more, Lester, people who are close to the president, and I'm going to try to pull this up. Mick Mulvaney, I believe, is among them, calling on the president to say something. His allies, his aides, getting out there on Twitter, saying, hey, stop. This is not okay. This is not appropriate. This is not who we are. The president's former campaign manager, for example, doing the same. But now there are some who are pushing the president publicly, Lester, to try to come out and do something more forcefully. This is a president who, as our colleague Kelly O'Donnell noted, ended his speech at the rally, what was then a rally several hours ago, earlier this morning, by telling people we're going to walk up to the Capitol, basically. Amping them up, to use that kind of language, to come up to the Capitol. And what was, and I was on Capitol Hill, Lester, not 3-4 hours ago, and I'm telling you, I saw from our own eyes, didn't look like this, obviously. It was a mostly peaceful protest. It has turned into something very different, much uglier now. You will see, moving forward, discussion about what the president has been doing, where he has been for these last 2 hours, for these last 2.5 hours. And the moment of leadership, there will be critics who will suggest that the president has not met some of those moments in the past. But now you're seeing even some of his allies talk about this. For example, Kevin McCarthy, of course, the minority leader over on the House side, sounding rather shaken. He was over on another network calling this un-American, suggesting that, yes, he would perhaps have people reach out to the president and see if he would do more. Now, the president has tweeted two tweets in the couple of hours that we've been watching this, but the leadership factor on this is going to be critical. The other point that I want to make, Lester, I live in Washington. That's obviously where I'm reporting to you from now. It's 3:30 in the afternoon. It will get dark in a matter of, in a matter of 90 minutes or so, and you still have thousands of people out on the west front and east front of the Capitol. They've got to clear these folks before this situation potentially gets even more disturbing. I can tell you that I know people who are having their kids, who don't have anything to do with Capitol Hill, who are having their kids affected because of the lockdowns that have been in place now, their families. This is a ripple effect. It's why you've seen the mayor of Washington institute that 6 o'clock curfew. And at that point, that could be a potential tension point, Lester, if in fact these people who are storming the Capitol are still out there.
Hallie, thank you. I want to bring in Andrea Mitchell right now. Andrea, you have seen and covered it all. Give me your thoughts about what's happening here. And also, I'm curious whether this might derail the objections that were planned for this long process of counting these electoral votes today.
Well, I certainly think on the Senate side, I would find it very difficult for Senator Cruz and Senators Hawley and the others to now have to face not only Mitch McConnell, but the rest of their colleagues who have had this horrible, really violent protest because they broke into the Capitol of the United States of America. They hijacked our democracy while the Electoral College vote count, the vote was being counted. It was already certified, but it was being counted. And the process is going to pick up. They'll figure this out. I was talking earlier, interviewing Terry Gaynor, the former head of the Capitol Police, former sergeant at arms, and he said they will, bit by bit, they will move enough people in. They have, more than 1,000 Capitol Police. Clearly, they did not prevent the Capitol building from being breached on the second floor level, as you saw on the east front. That was where they got in, apparently, to both the Senate and the House floor and to the same level as Statuary Hall. So what you saw were these protesters in the chambers, in the Senate chamber, in the House chamber. Thankfully, the Capitol Police had removed Vice President Pence, certainly Senator Pro Tem Chuck Grassley, who's also in the succession chain. Also the Speaker of the House, we understand, all the senators are now in safe places. You have members of the House and others who were off the floor because of COVID, not part of the joint session, who were planning their speeches. We talked to Alyssa Slotkin from Michigan, who was planning her speech. She's a former Pentagon and CIA official who has served in Iraq. At the same time, saying she's never even contemplated anything like this. And what she said was, you expect attacks in places like Iraq in wartime. You don't expect it in the Capitol building of the United States. The only time I've ever seen the Capitol evacuated was after 9/11, when we thought that plane was coming, the plane that ended up, heading towards Pennsylvania. We thought that plane, I believe it was that plane, was coming to the Capitol building. And that's when they were evacuated through a tunnel and safely further up Independence Avenue. So I've never seen anything like this, and I have to say, it is shocking, and it was started really by the President of the United States inciting that crowd. And that is as shocking as the failure of the police to prevent the Capitol building from being breached.
Andrea Mitchell, thank you for your insight there. I want to bring in my colleague, Savannah Guthrie, right now as we continue our expanded coverage. We're a little past 3:30 here in the East, and this siege, if you will, continues to go on. Welcome, Savannah.
Welcome to a scene we never thought we would witness, Lester. What's happening in the U.S. Capitol this afternoon, I'll bring you up to date on what I've seen. The governor of Virginia has tweeted that he has answered a request for the Virginia National Guard to help out and to try to regain some sense of control at the Capitol right now. As mentioned, there are reports that one woman has been shot, reportedly by law enforcement. We await more information about that. We have seen those images, disturbing images of protesters inside the Capitol, breaching the Capitol, inside the Speaker's office, inside the Senate chamber, walking about freely as though this were not the heart of our democracy, performing its moment, its most sacred moment of the peaceful transition to power. These are momentous times. I want to bring Kasie Hunt into this. She's our Capitol Hill correspondent. She's been there from the beginning. First of all, Kasie, just we can all save the analysis for later. Just bring us up to date on what you know and what the status is of getting this situation under control.
Been the hardest piece of this to pin down, what they're going to do next to try and get this under control. As you mentioned, those requests from the National Guard to try and help deal with this situation, but whether they are en route is unclear. Remember, the District of Columbia falls into a little bit of a strange spot because it's not a state. So questions about what the Defense Department may do in that instance, we are waiting to find out and are in touch with the Speaker's office. But it has been an incredibly difficult day here on Capitol Hill. It started, of course, with the initial proceedings to begin the process to ratify President-elect Joe Biden as President of the United States. That all unfolded, it seemed, as it should have at the beginning. But of course, these protesters approached the building, ultimately breached the Capitol, and then breached the House and Senate floors, which is not something I don't think anyone who was walking into this building today anticipated. And certainly those of us who have been working up here every day for many, many years now have never seen anything like this before. So you are seeing increasingly Republicans coming out and calling on President Trump to urge the people who are here to stand down. Kevin McCarthy, the House leader, was recently interviewed on Fox News. He called it un-American. He said it needs to stop. He said that he didn't even want to talk about some of the things that he had seen in the chamber. He referenced shots fired, and I know our Pete Williams reported that. Our producer Haley Talbot was in the House of Representatives in the gallery watching the floor as events unfolded there, as the Capitol Police barricaded one of the doors as they evacuated members of the House of Representatives. Some of those members donning gas masks that are situated under the chairs in that chamber because there were chemical irritants that were discharged in the attempts to try and clear these protests. So at this point, we do know members of congressional leadership are safe. Members of the House and Senate are being taken to undisclosed locations, most of them already in those undisclosed locations if they weren't part of those initial groups. I've texted with several members of the Senate who have said that they are safe, that they feel safe at this point. So it does seem as though that element of this has been diffused, at least. The last few minutes here have felt more like stasis. The members who are involved in the actual functioning of our government have been removed from the immediate danger of the situation, and now the question is, how are they going to move forward and secure the building? So we are here in the Russell Senate office building, where things have been largely quiet. Across the street, of course, the Capitol building, where you can see those protesters still milling around. But again, Savannah, important to underscore, this has halted the process, the regular process of our government.
Yeah, Kasie, that's where I was going. I mean, this is January 6th. This is a date that was in stone. This is when you're supposed to certify the electors for the transition of power. I mean, that obviously is not possible right now. I heard one congressman on one of the cable networks saying, a Republican congressman, a Trump supporter, saying he wants the president to say, call it off, to do more, to say more right now. So far, as this has unfolded, at first we saw a tweet from the president talking about how Mike Pence, the vice president, had let him down by not doing something that was not within his power to do. But then he also has said we should support our law enforcement. But he has, Kasie, to be clear, we haven't heard the president say to these protesters, stop, it's over, as this Republican Congressman Trump supporter has said he wishes the president would do now.
And you're absolutely right. And there are more Republicans who are saying that is exactly what needs to happen. Senator Marco Rubio is saying that is what it would mean to support law enforcement. Law enforcement have been overrun here. And the reality is that this is supposed to be a formal transfer of power from one administration to the next. And in fact, Senator Mitch McConnell was on the floor of the Senate, someone who critics, have said waited too long to criticize President Trump. But even he this morning was saying we have to believe these results. If we don't, then our democracy is going to begin a decline. A death spiral was the phrase that he used. So that's how we started the day. And then just minutes later, this scene unfolds in the United States Capitol, which, again, I think it's important to realize most of these procedures are laid out in the Constitution. They are some of the oldest things that govern how we govern ourselves, how we work as a democracy. It's certainly something that I know many members of Congress who I talk to every day have taken great pride in being a part of that democracy. And right now we're seeing it halted by these people.
Absolutely.
Savannah.
Casey, sorry to cut you off. I want to jump to a member of Congress, Brendan Boyle, who's a Democrat from Pennsylvania. I believe he's on the phone. Congressman, I mean, first of all, are you safe? Are you okay? I don't expect you to tell us where you are, but what can you tell us about how you're doing right now?
Yeah, well, thank you. I am safe myself and a few other younger staffers I'll just say in my office, the building in which my office is located. Capitol Police have been running through the hallway, so you'll occasionally hear a commotion outside, and I'm not sure whether or not it's Capitol Police or one of the protesters, and then just continuing to wait on further updates from the Capitol Police.
And what did you witness today? What have you seen?
Well, I've obviously never seen anything like this before. And, you know, it wasn't a surprise that we were going to have this large crowd of protesters. So it's still a mystery to me how this crowd was able, within about 10 or 12 minutes of starting, able to breach both sides of the Capitol, both the east side and the west side, and get into or right around the House chamber, as well as apparently from texts I'm getting from friends of mine who serve in the Senate, they were able to get into the Senate chamber as well. So that is just absolutely inexplicable to me that this happened. But ultimately, though, the bigger threat, in my view, is not the thousands of people who are here today, even though they're armed and they are a threat. The bigger threat is actually those who have incited them all along the way, cheering this on. That's the real threat.
Well, at this point, what are you hoping? How do you think this will be resolved? And do you think Congress will be able to complete its constitutional duty? I mean, even though there seems to be a moment right now of stasis, for lack of a better word, right now the Capitol is not under control. It's still infiltrated by people who have broken through barriers and broken across the lines to come inside the Capitol. I mean, look at the image. I don't know if you can see it. We're seeing people inside offices, ceremonial offices, and real working offices inside the Capitol who have barged in and having their way with the place. So assuming that this can be gotten under control, a law enforcement matter, would it be your hope that Congress reconvene today and try to complete its constitutional duty?
Well, I immediately have two thoughts. The first is it's absolutely sickening to see this militia or armed mob bring us to the point of anarchy. Never in 1,000 years did I ever think I would see this in the capital of the United States of America. But then my second thought is, I don't care how long I have to stay here. We are going to do our damn constitutional duty. There's no way I'm going to be chased off the capital of my own country by this mob and whoever is inciting them. Yes, we will do the people's duty. We will ensure our constitutional process, come hell or high water, is followed, and that Joe Biden is inaugurated as President of the United States on the 20th of January.
Well, Congressman Boyle, I appreciate your time this afternoon. Stay safe, and you, and also all of the congressional staffers, a lot of young men and women who work there at the Capitol and are never seen. I wish them well as well. Thank you for your time.
Thank you.
About 3:45 on the East Coast, as you can see, this protest, whatever you want to call it, it's not a peaceful protest, as the demonstrators here have crossed barriers. They've crossed a line, and they are now breaching the United States Capitol, forcing the Senate and House to evacuate and pause in the middle of a cherished and sacred constitutional duty having to do with the peaceful transfer of power. Debate is one thing. Protest is one thing. That's not what we're watching here, Lester, and we'll continue to keep our eye on it.
No, absolutely. We understand that now from Tom Winter, one of our producers, one person in critical condition after being shot at the Capitol. At least 5 people have been transported to hospitals, including several officers who were treated for pepper spray exposure. 4 other people have been transferred from the Capitol as well. So we continue to watch that play out. And we certainly saw pictures a moment ago, still pictures of security officials with weapons drawn, trying to barricade a door. So the situation is extremely serious as it plays out right now. I want to go to Kristen Welker, who is at the White House. Kristen, I'd say all eyes of the world are trained on the White House, but right now the Capitol is the focus. But the answer could come from the White House. Are we getting anything beyond the tweets the president issued? Is there a growing chorus of calls for him to try to put a stop to this?
There is a growing chorus of calls. Lester, let me read you a tweet from Press Secretary Kayleigh McEnany. A little bit of breaking news here. She says, at Real Donald Trump's direction, the National Guard is on the way, along with other federal protective services. We reiterate President Trump's call against violence and to remain peaceful. So there you have it. The National Guard has been deployed to Washington, D.C., to the Capitol to try to deal with these protests that are unfolding and this breach of the U.S. Capitol. Now, the messaging that we're getting from the White House, this is the latest from Vice President Mike Pence, who says the violence and destruction taking place at the U.S. Capitol must stop, and it must stop now. Anyone involved must respect law enforcement officers and immediately leave the building. Similar language from President Trump in a pair of tweets that he sent out earlier, Lester, but his supporters believe that that just does not go far enough, that they want to hear from President Trump himself, that they want him to come out and address his supporters and tell them, bottom line, stand down. Let me paint the scene for you at the White House right now, Lester. You have White House officials who are huddled in their offices, who are watching all of this unfold. I spoke with one official who told me that the president is watching this unfold as well. Of course, discussions about whether or not he is going to speak, whether there will be some type of written statement. But at this point, nothing on the horizon. So I think you are going to see the calls grow louder for him to come out and address these protesters. Lester.
All right. Thank you, Kristen. NBC News contributor and founder of Punchbowl News, Jake Sherman, joins us on the line. Jake, I understand you are in the Capitol. What can you see? What can you tell us?
Well, I can see nothing at the moment, Lester, because we've been in lockdown. I'm just going to not say where because I want to protect our safety. But I've been covering this building for 11 years. I've never obviously seen anything like this. I usually can't get through security with my AirPods or my belt, and these people have broken down doors. This is a mob. This is not a protest. This is an armed mob, and this is despicable and really, really, really unsafe. And we're all very scared.
Did you, I know you're in lockdown right now, but have you heard any of the protesters nearby?
Oh, yeah. When I was at the beginning of the protest, I walked outside to see what was going on and walked past a floor up. I was standing elevated, and people were breaking down the windows to very, very large and very secure doors. They had a flagpole, and they were knocking through windows. We've heard banging on our doors. We saw SWAT teams with long guns walking through the building. I fortunately was not in the chamber. All of my colleagues and members of Congress who were in the chamber were taken out. We still, where I am right now, have not been evacuated from the Capitol building, but hope to be soon, frankly, because we don't have security like many members of Congress do.
Yeah. All right, Jake, stay safe, and we do hope we'll get you out of there as soon as possible. Savannah.
Hi, Lester. I want to bring in Senator Tammy Duckworth, who, of course, is a veteran herself, a wounded veteran, I might add. Senator Duckworth, were you on the Senate floor when this happened? How are you doing? Are you safe?
I am safe. I'm barricaded in a secure location. I was actually on my way to the Senate floor in the tunnels underneath the Capitol when the Capitol Police turned me around and had me go to a secure location. So I am safe with a couple of my staff members, and I've defended our Constitution for 23 years in their service, and now for 8 years here on the Capitol Hill, and I've never, in my wildest dreams, would I ever think that Americans would do this to our own nation's capital.
I mean, I'm sure you are seeing the images I'm seeing. The United States Senate, the floor of the United States Senate, the Congress being taken over by people who have breached barricades, who've gone past police, who are where they are not permitted to be. Have you gotten any kind of communication? I don't imagine all 100 senators are on a text chain, but have you heard anything from the leadership about the plan to get this back under control and what might happen in terms of the constitutional duty that Congress has today?
I've not heard anything directly from the Republican leader's office. I am getting information from my leadership team who are following up on every one of us and where we are located, all the Democrats and those who caucus with us. And, you know, again, listen, my entire adult life had defended people's rights to protest. And peaceful protest is something that I absolutely support. But this is a mob. This is a riot. These are people who are not practicing democracy. In fact, they are, you know, doing the will of a wannabe tin pot dictator who lost the election. And this is no way for us to be running our country and really doing the work that needs to be done, which is fight a global pandemic and get working families back up on their feet again.
Senator, I mean, you're as tough as they come. As I mentioned, you are a wounded veteran who served our country, but was there any moment today when you were on your way to the Capitol and you were turned around in a rush? I mean, what went through your mind? Did you feel fear or concern or anxiety about your own safety?
You know, I don't. I did not feel fear or concern. I did what the Capitol Police asked me to do, because that is the best thing to do, is just to follow their direction and to take myself out of the equation so that I would be one less person they would have to worry about, and that they could concentrate on their jobs and focus on those who were breaching the Capitol. I will tell you this. These protesters will not stop me from carrying out my duties as have been laid out for me in the Constitution. And if we have to be here all night and all day tomorrow and the next day, we will continue to carry out the work that needs to be done. And I'm not going to be deterred from standing my ground. You know, I will not quit my post. I will be here and I will do the people's business.
Senator Tammy Duckworth of Illinois, thank you for calling in. Stay safe. Keep us posted. We'll stay in touch with you. Appreciate it. Lester, over to you.
Thanks. I want to bring in Hallie Jackson right now, Savannah, who is, of course, is our chief White House correspondent. Hallie, you know, the president spoke to this crowd today. So much of what we've been hearing, of course, is that the inauguration will go on the 20th. Are there concerns that what's happening today could, obviously you can't move that date, but could have a tremendous effect on how we mark that day?
You can't imagine, Lester, that it's not going to, right? Or at least have a discussion or a conversation about that, given what we're seeing unfolding. I think to give people some perspective here, and remember, in inaugurations past, this is what happens. You have typically the president-elect on the west front of the Capitol. You have that sort of parade down Pennsylvania Avenue to the White House. Things had been changing and in flux very much anyway because of the pandemic. And by the way, it's a pandemic that is still very much happening and very much active currently. And the question now is, will this change even more on Inauguration Day, given the scene here, given the security and the safety perspective? One of the things that you have talked about, Lester, as you see these images, you said earlier you might feel sort of sick looking at that. It is stunning, I think, to people in this country, as well as to people in the international community. The head of NATO, the NATO Secretary General, calling these shocking scenes in Washington and saying the outcome of this democratic election must be respected. Lester, that is the kind of sentence that you hear aimed at other countries, not the United States, that you haven't ever heard aimed at the United States. To give you some perspective of the way that this is being seen and the way that it is being perceived and happening here in the United States and around the world as well. As far as the president goes, another one of his allies, again, more and more of his allies coming out now saying he needs to appear. There was a mention perhaps of, and we heard earlier some reporting, question marks, excuse me, as our studios are kind of going off here, I'm just going to hang this phone up, question marks on whether the president would deliver, for example, a written statement, a speech. A written statement isn't going to cut it at this point. And frankly, Lester, I think there is also a fair question of whether a formal deliverance of remarks from President Trump is enough to stop what's happening here, to get these rioters, frankly, to turn around and leave the Capitol. We know now, based on the reporting from our teams, that the National Guard and the press secretary has confirmed that the National Guard is coming in. You have other states now, neighboring states here, Maryland, Virginia, sending in the National Guard as well. The change of mission has been approved, as you see on the screen. I think it is also important to note, as we talk about the process, Congressman Brendan Boyle of Pennsylvania saying, we are absolutely going to get this work done. Logistically, Lester, that is going to be almost impossible to do anytime in the immediate term future because of this unbelievable security breach that has happened. You cannot send members of Congress back into a House chamber that hasn't been swept. You can't send members of Congress back into offices where people who have not been screened are there, not just putting their feet up on the table, but doing, you just don't know. And that is an enormous security breach, as now we see this remarkable scene of this line of cars, police vehicles, law enforcement vehicles, lights and sirens on, coming down. I can't quite get my bearings from this chopper shot here as to which angle we're looking at, north or south. But this is obviously the main drag here heading into the Capitol on the Mall. The backup is coming. That seems to be what's happening here, and it is desperately needed at this moment because you still have to get these protesters cleared out if you're law enforcement. Okay, and I see the perspective there, Lester.
Yeah, and of course a 6 p.m. curfew is now looming as we watch more security descend on the Capitol, preparing for whatever may come. And we should also note, before I hand it back over to Savannah, those pictures we've been seeing of people occupying offices and parts of the Capitol, those pictures are shocking, but it should also be noted they are potential evidence as well. Savannah?
No question about that for a later time, but right now we're still in the middle of it. This Capitol not under control, but in fact overrun by a mob of people. Let me get to Pete Williams. I think he's got some reporting on the law enforcement efforts here. Pete, what is the plan here, or what is beginning to be a plan?
Well, we know now that the FBI has been deployed at the request of Capitol Police to help. We know that Homeland Security is sending people, Homeland Security investigations, presumably. Obviously, you've got Metro Police from the D.C., the police department here, the local police department, in addition to the Capitol Police. We know that they've asked for assistance from the National Guard. So they won't at some point later lack for manpower to empty out the Capitol. And that's obviously the immediate chore here, is to get the Capitol emptied out, secured. They've got to go through all these spaces and make sure that they're swept and secure and that nobody else is hiding out inside the building. You're looking at now at the house side of the Capitol complex. That's Independence Avenue, where traffic is being restricted. Police are using that as a sort of a staging area. And then you see the Capitol come into the view. That's the House chamber on your left, then the center, the rotunda, and that little sort of square section between the House and the rotunda. Inside there is Statuary Hall, under that curved dome with the little cupola on top. Under that is Statuary Hall. That's the old House chamber, and that's where you saw those dramatic pictures today of people streaming from the rotunda toward the House chamber, which is what now is just disappearing on the left side of the screen. And then the center part of the Capitol, and then on the right would be the Senate chamber. Obviously, that is the concern now, to get things squared away so that the counting can resume. You were talking about this earlier, Savannah. By law, by the Electoral Counting Act, it has to start today, but there's no limit in how long it takes. They'll keep going until they're done. And if they're not done by Inauguration Day, and I have no reason to think that they won't be, but if they're not, then there's procedures to have, there's the Succession Act. The Speaker would become president temporarily until they can figure out who the president is, but which obviously will be Joe Biden. Now, on the law enforcement side, we've noted that one person was shot inside the U.S. Capitol by someone from law enforcement, not sure which agency that was. We've been told by law enforcement authorities that at least one improvised explosive device was found on the Capitol grounds, not inside a building, but on the Capitol grounds, and possibly a second item. We know that law enforcement people are looking at that. Earlier this afternoon, before we saw people storming the Capitol, the big concern was evacuation of the Library of Congress, which is directly across the street from the Capitol, and a portion of a House office building.
And Pete, in case we have not caught up on this note, Kayleigh McEnany, the press secretary for the White House, said that the National Guard is on the way along with other federal protective services. And she says, we reiterate President Trump's call against violence and to remain peaceful, but we have not heard from the president, not recently, not within the last few moments, asking folks who are gathered there at the Capitol to call it off and to stop. Let me go to Kasie Hunt. Kasie, obviously, first question is always what's happening there behind you, but also I know we've heard from the Democratic leaders of the House and Senate now.
We have, Savannah, and they are calling for the president to do just what you said he has not yet done, which is to demand that all protesters leave the U.S. Capitol and Capitol grounds immediately. That is a joint statement from the House Speaker, Nancy Pelosi, and the Minority Leader in the Senate, Chuck Schumer. Now, I can also tell you, Savannah, that what has started today as fear, chaos, uncertainty about what was going on is hardening into resolve and determination to get the government back on track. So one member who is at the secure location where they've taken members of the House tells me that one Democrat and one Republican, Hakeem Jeffries, the Democrat, Liz Cheney, the Republican, informed those members on lockdown that the National Guard is on the way. There was applause in the room, and this member said to me that we will return to the floor and do our jobs, was the quote. I also heard from a member of the Senate who was also taken to the Senate side secure location. This member is safe. This member also told me that these thugs will not win the day, essentially, that they are prepared to go back onto the Senate floor. Senator Joe Manchin telling me we're all okay and ready to get back to our chamber and finish our work. These thugs cannot and will not run us off. We will continue to govern. And yes, Savannah.
Oh, I wanted to try to understand because, we just talked to Senator Duckworth. It sounded like she was in her office. Everybody wasn't, all 535 members of Congress weren't all there at the same time. But are there various locations where there are groups of senators or groups of congressmen sheltering together? Did I catch that?
Yes, that's right. So it's a little bit complicated, and it depends on where you were when this started to unfold. So we saw the joint session begin this process. Then the House and the Senate separated to their respective chambers, and they started debating this question. And it was during that point that protesters breached the Capitol, and they eventually, of course, breached the floor of the House and the floor of the Senate. So because of coronavirus, not everyone is allowed in the chambers at the same time. Normally, of course, there are 435 members of the House, 100 members of the Senate. All of them have a chair or a desk. But with social distancing, you can't do that. So that means that groups of members were scattered in different places when this all unfolded. Many of the senators had just processed back across the Capitol. They had started their debate in the Senate chamber. So there was I would say a higher proportion of the chamber was present over on the Senate side. And then you also had a bunch of House members still on the floor of the House. And as it unfolded, and we had the video, in fact, that you're watching right now is from Haley Talbot, who's our producer, who was inside the chamber as this was unfolding. She was with some members who were up there in the gallery. That's the level that's above the House floor as they were all being evacuated. So many of those members were taken together in a group to a different location in the Capitol complex. We happen to know where this one is, but we're not reporting it because obviously there are many security concerns about that. The Senate, meanwhile, had a similar situation. There were members on the floor who were evacuated together. So those members are also telling me, I've talked to a couple of them, I know they're in the same place. We don't know where they are, but we do know that they are safe and that a number of them are together. Then, of course, if you were a member who was not on the floor and not part of that escort from Capitol Police, you may be at any other place, your office building, your own personal office. So that's kind of how these things are set up here.
Got it. Casey, got to jump. Let's listen to the President-elect Joe Biden.
Coming out to speak to you. I initially was going to talk about the economy, but all of you have been watching what I've been watching. At this hour, our democracy is under an unprecedented assault, unlike anything we've seen in modern times. An assault on the citadel of liberty, the Capitol itself. An assault on the people's representatives and the Capitol Hill Police sworn to protect them. And the public servants who work at the heart of our republic. An assault on the rule of law like few times we've ever seen it. An assault on the most sacred of American undertakings, the doing of the people's business. Let me be very clear. The scenes of chaos at the Capitol do not reflect a true America, do not represent who we are. What we're seeing are a small number of extremists dedicated to lawlessness. This is not dissent. It's disorder. It's chaos. It borders on sedition. And it must end now. I call on this mob to pull back and allow the work of democracy to go forward. You've heard me say before in different contexts, the words of a president matter, no matter how good or bad that president is. At their best, the words of a president can inspire. At their worst, they can incite. And therefore, I call on President Trump to go on national television now to fulfill his oath and defend the Constitution and demand an end to this siege, to storm the Capitol, to smash windows, to occupy offices, the floor of the United States Senate, rummaging through desks, on the Capitol, on the House of Representatives, threatening the safety of duly elected officials. It's not protest, it's insurrection. The world's watching. Like so many other Americans, I am genuinely shocked and saddened that our nation, so long the beacon of light and hope for democracy, has come to such a dark moment. Through war and strife, America's endured much, and we will endure here, and we will prevail again, and will prevail now. The work of the moment and the work of the next 4 years must be the restoration of democracy, of decency, honor, respect, the rule of law, just plain, simple decency. The renewal of the politics. It's about solving problems, looking out for one another, not stoking the flames of hate and chaos. As I said, America's about honor, decency, respect, tolerance. That's who we are. That's who we've always been. The certification of the Electoral College vote is supposed to be a sacred ritual. The purpose is to affirm the majesty of American democracy. But today's a reminder, a painful one, that democracy is fragile. And to preserve it requires people of goodwill, leaders with the courage to stand up, who are devoted not to the pursuit of power, or the personal interest pursuits of their own selfish interest at any cost, but of the common good. Think what our children watching television are thinking. Think what the rest of the world is looking at. For nearly 2.5 centuries, we, the people, in search of a more perfect union, have kept our eyes on that common good. America is so much better than what we've seen today. Watching the scenes from the Capitol, I was reminded, as I prepared other speeches in the past, I was reminded of the words of Abraham Lincoln in his annual message to Congress, whose work has today been interrupted by chaos. Here's what Lincoln said. He said, "We shall nobly save or merely lose the last hope on earth. Went on to say, the way is plain, peaceful, generous, just. A way which, if followed, the world will forever applaud, and God must forever bless. The way is plain here, too. That's who we are. It's the way of democracy, of respect, of decency, of honor, and commitment as patriots to this nation. Notwithstanding what I saw today and we're seeing today, I remain optimistic about the incredible opportunities. There has never been anything we can't do when we do it together. And this God-awful display today is bringing home to every Republican and Democrat and Independent in the nation that we must step up. This is the United States of America. There's never, ever, 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 ever been a thing we've tried to do that we've done it together. We've not been able to do it. So, President Trump, step up. May God bless America. And may God protect our troops and all those folks at the Capitol who are trying to preserve order. Thank you, and I'm sorry to have kept you waiting.
We've seen today. President-elect Joe Biden calling on President Trump to step up, calling what's happening at the Capitol right now a democracy under assault, and calling on the president to go on national TV to call for an end of the violence we've seen in and outside the U.S. Capitol tonight. An extraordinary moment. Joe Biden actually making a few comments.